Hi. Hi, and welcome to the lecture on food and agriculture. So this week we're talking about how we grow food, how that becomes a resource use, some of the consequences of our choices, and how we can start to fix our agricultural system, which is not functioning in a way that's really constructive for everybody on planet Earth, despite the fact that we actually grow enough food to feed everybody that's here now. Matter of fact, we grow currently enough food to feed 11 billion people, and yet we still have hunger, starvation, famine, and malnutrition, both in the United States as well as globally. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of agriculture and how agriculture has changed, how that plays into our choices around natural resources. And then we're going to talk about the idea of food sovereignty. And this will fit in with the videos that are required for this week so that they all kind of fit together and kind of give us some solutions when we start to think about agriculture. So, food and agriculture. Agriculture has actually transformed the planet in many ways. There are a lot of ecosystems that don't exist today because of agriculture, including vast swaths of the prairie lands in North America, which is now primarily used for wheat, corn, soy, and some other agricultural products, as well as grazing. We've seen a decline in the wild herds. Many of those have been replaced with grazing for agriculture, including beef, goats, and other resources like that. And of course, contemporary agriculture is really organized around a series of commodities that are sold by large agro businesses. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So when we think through agriculture, we talk usually about three agricultural revolutions. So the first agricultural revolution is basically the rise of agriculture and some really basic things that occur that I'm going to talk a little bit more about over the next couple slides. Then there's the second agricultural revolution, which is really about the dramatic improvements of outputs such as crops and livestock. These include improved yokes for oxen, replacement of ox with the horse, and really the beginning of an understanding around the importance of nutrition for crops as well as drainage. We start to see a lot more irrigation. We start to see the intentional use of fertilizers, not chemical fertilizers, but usually manure. And then there's the third agricultural revolution, which is really characterized by mechanization, basically switching out animals and humans with machines, and other types of mechanized farming, the rise of synthetics, both in terms of herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides, which also enhanced yields for a bit. And then basically the manufacturing of food as a global system. So today, you might be raising chickens in North Carolina, but they are sent somewhere else to be slaughtered, processed, packaged, frozen, and sent back to your grocery store, even if they were raised down the block from you. So, because of this globalized agricultural system, the outputs that we have, especially in terms of environmental outputs, are really different than they were historically. So let's talk about the origins of agriculture. And we begin in the Holocene period, which is about 9,000 BCE, before the Common Era. And this is where we start to see a couple interesting things occur. We know that there's a switch going on in the global climate, which actually frees up more land. We see the recession of glaciers going north at a much slower pace than they are today, but still the recession of glaciers. And that opens up more grazing lands. And so we see herds actually start to move north. And this creates, in some ways, a scarcity of meat products. But we also start to see the conversion of hunter-gatherers into more pastoral or agrarian societies. Now, hunter-gatherers, it sounds like they're just kind of hoping Mother Nature's going to provide, but that is not true at all. Humans, basically, since they figured out how to capture fire, have intentionally groomed the landscape for their benefit. And their primary tool was fire. They knew that if they put fire on the land, certain plants are going to come about at certain key points in time. So for instance, if you're using hazelnut for basketry, which is pretty common, the best times for you to harvest hazelnut is within 1 to 2 years after a fire, because the stems are still straight, so you can use them. This is true for a lot of other grasses. And so they're putting fire intentionally on the land in order to groom the resources that they need. Now, we start to see the settling of people into one location around this time. And part of this is continuing on and expanding with that intentionality in how they're using the landscape. And this is especially true when it comes to grains, the growth of wheat, barley, and other sorts of ancient grains that people have been using for literally 10,000 years. We also start to see different types of tool use. So we see more saws and drills. We see the development of plows. And you should know the shape of plows in 9000 BCE is basically the shape of plows today. The difference is the materials they're made out of and how they're used to cut through the landscape. Now, if it's just you as a human cutting through the landscape, you really need to have softer soils. You need to, you're mostly doing this next to rivers because you're depending upon flooding and rain for your irrigation and to water your crops. But as we see the sophistication and the real development of this tool use around agriculture, we start to see an expansion of how crops are used. And this also has a really big impact on global populations. So before agriculture, the environment as it was could support about 10 million people globally. That's like the population of the Bay Area, the end, for the entire planet. And between then and about 1000 BCE, we see the population grow to about 100 million people. So that's a growth tenfold. And we see this happen a lot after any type of massive revolution in agriculture. We see giant spurts in populations because suddenly the land can provide more. So as agriculture developed, we ended up with different types of cultures that develop. So when we talk about an agrarian society, and we often romanticize this idea of the agrarian culture or agrarian society, this means it's the way of life in an agricultural based society. So the example you may be most familiar with in the United States is the Amish. They still live in a fairly agrarian society. They have rejected mechanization. They're still using animals as their primary plow techniques if they're doing plantings. And so the agrarian way of life is something that we've romanticized, but it's hard work. And frankly, 1 year of crop failure could wipe out an entire society, because if you don't have enough food stored up to last you until your next harvest, or if you only have enough food stored up to last you until your next harvest and you have a bad harvest, you have a very hard future. So I just talked about hunter-gatherers on the fact that they were not just these passive people on the land, but actively engaging with the landscape, including the use of fire, intentional plantings, but not quite at the level we usually associate with agriculture. Now, when we think through what is agriculture, most agriculture in the first revolution and a good chunk of the second revolution, and in many parts of the world today, is still subsistence agriculture. So subsistence agriculture is you eat most of what you produce. You're not producing a single crop in mass for sale. You're producing the food you're going to eat. And so when we think of subsistence farmers, if that's the only food that you have, then that can be really problematic. Also, if you don't have enough land available, that could be problematic. And think back to the Rwanda example, the chapter that we read about Rwanda, and how you have smaller and smaller plots of areas available to people in order to engage in agriculture, even though family size is staying the same. So it becomes harder and harder to actually feed your family if you're engaging in subsistence agriculture. One of the ways that we engage with the land is around slash and burn. So slash and burn is basically you clear a landscape, burn it, and use that to add nutrients back into the soil. This is especially true if you have to expand into new areas for agriculture. And in the ancient civilizations that we've studied, this was pretty common, especially as populations grew. You ended up starting to use slash and burn to clear up hills and other landscapes that just weren't as productive as the primary areas where you were engaging in agriculture. But this becomes a primary way for people to clear land and become to be able to grow some of their own food. And then finally, there's the idea of pastoralism. A pastoralist is someone who is doing animal husbandry. So a farmer is growing food in the ground with plants. A pastoralist is breeding and herding animals. Once again, there are a lot of cultures who solely subsist or mostly subsist on animal products, right? So you've got milk, meat, you've got hides, you've got bones, you've got all of these things that you can use for your subsistence. And so a pastoralist is someone who is engaging in livestock. So agriculture actually starts in these primary seed hearths, these areas here, and then it spreads, these light areas. This is where we see agriculture starts to develop. This is subsistence agriculture, replacing hunting and gathering. It happens almost all at the same time, and then you can see how this spreads out. You can see here in the Middle East, when we think of the Middle East today, we think of it as a big dry desert. 2,000 years ago, it was not that way. 5,000 years ago, it was not that way. It was actually very lush, fertile rainforests turned into farms. And so we see the development of agriculture in these areas. It should also be noted that these areas are all near major rivers. And then we see that spread, and we see pastoralism also developing and spreading. So we have these primary areas that we know that agriculture developed from, and then we have these secondary areas that happened a little bit later, but also were huge centers of the development of agriculture. Couple things that agriculture did for humans. A lot of people still needed to engage in agriculture in order to produce enough food. But if a farmer can produce enough for 1.5 families, and you have, 10 farmers producing enough food for 1.5 families, you have 5 families now that are freed up from the need to engage in firsthand agriculture to feed themselves. They can rely on others. And this actually frees them up to create more sophisticated things like economic systems and fancier governments and what we think of today as civilization. And that's part of the reason why some of these areas are the key areas of the development of civilization, is because this is where agriculture develops. Now, when we think through the development of agriculture, up until late Second Revolution, early Third Revolution, think the early 1900s, most people actually engaged in agriculture. That's what they did. They were farmers. And as we see mechanization come into place, we see a number of things actually switch. And so in the industrialization of agriculture, these advances actually condense the number of people who need to engage in agriculture. We also see the rise of corporations and capitalism. Capitalism becomes really prevalent in the late 1700s, early 1800s, And certainly as we see the Industrial Revolution kick into place, corporate agriculture becomes a huge thing. And today it is the dominant system of agriculture globally. Now, this all occurs because of the industrialization of agriculture, or the third agricultural revolution. So we see some really important developments. First is changes in rural labor activities. Whereas the average family could maybe run a 30 to 40 acre farm, and that's a big area for a family to clear and grow food on. Today, with mechanization, with tractors, with all the big farming equipment we have, one family can run hundreds of acres. Matter of fact, we used to have about 80% of the American labor force was engaged in agriculture in the 1800s, and today it's about 2%, and that's because of that mechanization. And that, of course, really shifted labor in rural areas. We've seen a real decline in rural areas over time, partially because we don't need the labor in these areas, and people have moved to the cities to find other jobs. Another major innovation of agriculture is inputs into farming. And this includes things like fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, that once again shift how we engage in agriculture. People who develop these systems, I'm thinking of you, Monsanto, they own those products. They make a lot of money on those products. They sell not just weed killer, but they also then develop resistant crops to the weed killer, so you can spread the weed killer on those crops and not kill your crops, but try and kill the weeds. And we did see a pretty significant boom in the amount of productivity that agriculture was able to do, at least in the short term. There's growing amounts of research that are showing that other systems of agriculture can be just as productive and not as damaging, because a lot of these systems of production depend upon what's called a monoculture. Monoculture is where you have one crop. So around here, it's grapes. We do grow other fruits and vegetables, but we grow a lot of grapes here. If you go to the Midwest, it's corn for hundreds of miles and in every direction. I mean, like, it's corn followed by a side of corn. If you go up to the Palouse in Eastern Washington, it's wheat and wheat with a side of legumes. So where you're at really depends upon what your monoculture is. The upside of monoculture is you can be really focused in what you do. The downside of monoculture is Mother Nature can be really focused in what you do and often overcomes a lot of the inputs that we put into the monocultures. So for instance, we have corn, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about genetic modifications in a few slides, but this is a really good example. Like, we created corn that was genetically modified. And then finally, there's industrial substitutes. So this is developing different ways to use crops that we might not have otherwise used them. So a lot of corn in this country isn't grown for food, it's grown for ethanol, which is a substitute in our gas. We also see a lot of contract farming that comes up. So this is where a corporation contracts with a farmer to grow the crops. There's some real pluses and minuses in this. Oftentimes the farmers are left with all the issues and the corporations are left with all the assets. If you've never read or watched any of Michael Pollan's work, he actually goes into quite a bit. You can always read or watch Omnivore's Dilemma or King Corn, which is a video, to see some examples of this. Also, mechanized farming is expensive. It's really expensive to keep up on all the tractors and other equipment that you need. And because these things are expensive, it can also concentrate the farming, especially the more industrialized farming, in richer countries. And and in richer areas. So while this is a little bit old, things haven't actually changed that much in terms of the distribution of agriculture. So you can see here in the global south that there's still a lot of ranching, a lot of subsistence and shifting cultivation in these areas, whereas you see very concentrated areas in the global north, right? So here's in the United States where we have mixed crops. Over in this area, this kind of our Mediterranean climate where we grow a lot of grapes, lots of grain and ranching in this area. You can see what they do in Europe, what their primary crops are. Over here in Ukraine, where we're having a current war with Russia, you can see this is a huge area for wheat production. That's actually going to have a very big impact over the next few years on a lot of these countries that really depend upon importation of crops. One of the other things I wanted to point out is a couple slides ago, we talked about where agriculture originated from. And you can see right now, there's almost no agriculture in some of these primary areas because they've actually gotten too hot and too dry for agriculture. Again, a look at the different types of crops and crop production. You can see as mechanization and some of these other things come into play, we see an increase in crops across the planet. This gives you a feel of what types of crops are grown where. Maize, by the way, is corn as opposed to protein crops, rice, wheat. You can see wheat is the primary product of the Middle East and North Africa. That's actually declined over time since this chart was made. So one of the big things in agriculture is mechanization. And I'm actually going to post this link so you can watch this because, we talked about all the different ways that we wouldn't even think about using crops that we use it today. And I think that's really important to think through. Almost everything that you eat that's on your table is coming through mechanization, whether that's some of the newer combine harvesters, some of the remote work that's starting to be done. People are using remote sensoring over their fields to figure out where there's issues rather than physically going out there. So we're seeing a lot of farmers more invested in high-tech computer systems and water monitoring than they are out actually walking their fields. This also goes with pesticides and fungicides and herbicides. A lot of that is also mechanized today. And so a lot of the food that we eat today, from its inception through its arrival at your table, is mechanized. And that's not necessarily good or bad, although with this mechanization is an increase in the consumption of fossil fuels, which is adding to climate change. And of course, that's shifting how, where, and when we can grow crops. So agriculture accounts for, I believe, 8 to 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a pretty significant chunk. And part of it's because of the fact that, like I said before, the chicken might be raised in North Carolina, but it might be sent to China for processing. We know that fish that's caught off Alaska is also sent to China for processing. And that's to, and I'm using air quotes, save money, because labor over there is cheaper, but we are going to be paying a big cost for that. But this is a big profit savings for large ag. And of course, large corporations are legally obligated first to their shareholders to maximize profits. Like there's laws in the United States that say that. So they're doing their best to maximize the profits. The offsets are that one, we're paying higher prices for food because they can produce it for cheaper, pay people less, and ship it places all around the world to process it. And that helps maximize their profits. But they can also think of all these different ways to get us to utilize products and utilize crops in ways that we would never even think about doing. What people don't realize, and this is something that comes up in the video, is that, did you know there's pig parts in your bullets? Yeah, that's now used as a component of bullets. You would have never looked at a pig and go, yeah, that's part of bullets. So I'm going to post that video for you to watch. One of the other big developments is what's called a CAFO, a confined animal feedlot. This is one from Colorado, but you can go to the Central Valley and see these. If you go up to Lodi or Stockton or out near Harris Ranch, you can see the giant CAFOs. Matter of fact, there are more cows in some counties in California than there are people. And that's true in a number of places throughout the United States. So the food chain for animal products is pretty stacked in a very few number of corporations. In fact, 4 companies control 70% of all meat processing, and for poultry, it's 60%. Matter of fact, the way, if you ever watch The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I once again recommend, they talk about the idea of vertical integration, where Tyson owns just about every part of the process, while farmers basically get locked into contracts where they have to put up the housing, they have to go ahead and provide the water, they own all the manure, but they are supplied the feed, they are given strict instructions on how the animals are to be raised, and then somebody brings in the chicks and takes them out. So the farmers are just there basically to babysit the chickens while they grow, and are left with the manure and the dead chickens. This is having some real environmental problems in those places. We have huge piles of manure that are actually toxic because of the amount of antibiotics that are used in CAFOs. Anytime you have this many animals in a confined area, the spread of disease is really high. And so they preventatively use things like antibiotics in order to try and prevent the spread of the disease. Well, this is also one of the places we're also seeing the rise of antibiotic resistant bacteria coming from. So this is not necessarily working out for the people on the ground, but it's working out really well for corporations. Now, this is a resource choice, right? Rather than grazing these animals or having them spread out or putting their manure on crops, we're deciding to keep them in a very confined area that allows us to monitor and test them in a very controlled way. But we're left with a lot of leftover products that are not good for the farmers and not good for that land. And so there is a move in some areas to not have confined animal feeding lots, CAFOs. But there's still a lot of places where this is the dominant way that we engage in agriculture. This is just the pastoral version, basically, of monoculture, by the way. You can see there's no plants in this area. There's no grass. They're often fed corn, right? We talk about corn-fed beef. Corn is not necessarily a good product for cows to eat. It does fatten them up, but again, we're growing corn rather than feeding humans, we're feeding it to beef. So we've got shipping going on, we've got different areas that we're making resource choices with. So the most common types of monoculture that we have are corn, wheat, and soybeans. And of course you can process because it makes more profit. They make a lot more money off of high fructose corn syrup than they necessarily do selling you an ear of corn. And they've convinced a lot of industries to put things like high fructose corn syrup in everything. You'll find corn in your sodas, in your Big Mac patties, in your buns, in the secret sauce, on your McDonald's Big Mac. You'll find them in your Slim Jims because the cornstarch and dextrose and a lot of additives are actually made from corn. And you know, if you've ever had a Lunchable, you're basically eating corn, 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 and corn. You'll find corn in that meat, the bread, if the crackers, the cheese has corn in it. The drink has corn in it, little candy bar or cookie has corn in it. And it's because they convinced agriculture, they convinced manufacturers that corn is a great byproduct that they can sell. And of course, these are really subsidized by our government. We make a lot of choices around ag subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies to hold up these types of organizations. This does not necessarily help the farmer, by the way. Like, farmers are not out there making a ton of money. They don't have big profit margins. Oftentimes they have to have somebody on the farm that has a job off the farm in order to help support the farm. So this isn't actually helping farmers. This is helping those businesses, and that is a resource choice. So when we think of monocultures, we often think of corn as the big one. And part of how we've bred them is to produce more energy per pound. And that comes from the amount of sugar and fat that we've managed to put into these products. And they tend to have less water and fiber. Now, if you were to go out to Iowa today or Ohio, most of the corn out there is going to be what's called type 2 corn. And that is your high fructose corn syrup and fuel corn. Like, if you took a bite out of that corn, and I have, it's disgusting. It is not the type of corn you'd want to eat. And by the way, neither do the deer. I've seen deer walk through cornfields and be like, no, I'm good. Don't want any of this corn. And part of the way we've gotten here is through genetic modification. Now, I wanted to talk about genetic modification because it's gotten a bad rap. We have this idea of frankenfoods. Humans have always genetically modified their crops, whether they're choosing to burn an area back in the hunter-gatherer days as a way to grow certain types of roots, berries, nuts, tubers, and shoots, because that's what they're more interested in, and keep down the rest, right? That's a form of selection. Whether they're out there like Washington Carver was, and selectively crossbreeding with pollen, that's a form of genetic modification. Whether you're choosing to plant the seeds that have the most desired features, that's a form of genetic modification. Now, when we think of GMOs, we often think of like splicing genes, but most of the time it's actually whether you turn on and off a gene. It's usually working with the genetic code that's already there, or you're inserting genes from a wild cousin to help with a particular aspect of that crop. So a lot of these monocultures, though, they need more pesticides, they need more fertilizers, more fungicides, because there's not a lot of variety to protect that crop from the things that are going to destroy it. And this is a real issue in a lot of places that are engaging in monoculture, because as you put more fungicide on the fields, the funguses that survive are able to overcome the fungicides. You know, we talk about how Lysol wipes kill 99.9% of all germs. Well, that means 0.1% of germs are resistant, and they're still alive so they can breed. And they're the ones we end up with. Like that's part of how we end up here. And so this is kind of how monoculture impacts us. So part of where this comes from is what we call the Green Revolution. And this is technological developments that start in the 1940s that kind of revolutionize agriculture. We specifically start to grow high yield varieties of grain cereal. And it's coming from a good place, the Green Revolution. We know that there's a couple major famines that are going on, and the idea was to save people from starvation. And we can do this by developing high yield varieties of cereal grains, which is what most people are growing around the world. And then we can expand irrigation infrastructure, and think through the modernization of management techniques, and be able to help people feed themselves. And this really comes from a mass famine that was happening in India in the 1960s. And they worked with Norman Borlaug, who is considered the father of the Green Revolution, in order to try and do something about it. And, I just talked about these monocultures and the issues that we had with that. Well, we still have issues of famine and chronic hunger, mostly associated with poverty. We absolutely developed all of these things, but they've not been, these technologies and seeds and everything like that are not evenly spread around the globe. And one of the things that hopefully you've learned up to this point is that there's not a one size fit all solution to any problem. What's going to work in the Midwest of the United States is not going to work in sub-Saharan Africa and is not going to work in Southeast Asia. You have to develop solutions to the problems that are there. And unfortunately, we've tried to spread the Green Revolution and increase a lot of these yields and everything like that. But this distribution has not happened across the globe. We still see countries that have more money have more access to this food. They're more able to grow this food because they can afford all of these things. And even within countries, we see a lot of disparities that occur. I mean, the United States grows enough food that there shouldn't be hunger in our country, and yet we still have 40 million families in poverty, and children go hungry every day in a country that throws out tons of food. So the idea that, the idea behind the Green Revolution to be able to overcome hunger and things like that is a good one. But unless you have equity of distribution and you have equity in technology distribution, you're not going to get rid of some of these issues. And that brings us up to some of the emerging problems we have today. This is a map from 2018 that talks about the percentage of a population that is undernourished. So undernourishment or malnutrition is bad. Like the idea that it's, so undernourishment or malnutrition is defined as not getting enough healthy calories in your day. So this is, you're just not getting the right foods. It's not necessarily the amount of food, it's the right foods. So right now, I think the nutrition plate is half your calories are supposed to come from fruits and vegetables. About 20% is supposed to come from dairy and meat, and the rest is supposed to come from grains and other things. Well, we know that there are millions of people in the United States that do not have access to the right food. And the fact that there's countries where this information isn't shared basically tells you a lot about how we think about emerging malnourishment problems. Globally, there's about 150 million children who are stunted in their growth because of malnutrition. And there's about there's almost 2 billion people, adults who are overweight or obese because they are also not able to access the proper nutrition. In the United States, it's fast food, and not just McDonald's fast food. I'm also talking about food deserts where people don't actually have access to grocery stores. They have to do their shopping at corner stores or places like that where most of the food is packaged, high salt, high fat, and they're just not able to afford healthy food. And that has led to the chronic obesity issue. That's also a form of malnutrition here in the United States. We know that about 45% of death among children today is linked to malnutrition. And what's interesting is at the same time in these places, obesity among children is rising. So just because you have weight on your body does not mean that you are nourished. It does not mean that you have access to healthy foods or are making choices. A lot of people just don't have access to them. And this comes from the development of economic and social disparities, both within and across countries, around access to food, particularly healthy food. And that brings us to the idea of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the right of people as a human right to have access to healthy, nutritious food that is culturally relevant for them. And so there are 7 different principles when we talk about food sovereignty that we need to talk about. And first is that it needs to be focused on food for people, right? Remember I talked to you about all the corn that we grow, that's for fuel and high fructose corn syrup and things like that. Those are potential acres that could be for food, and they're not being used for food. And that's because we put profits at the center of our industrial systems rather than people. And so for food sovereignty to be a thing, food needs to be more than just a commodity. It needs to be something that is people-centered. I mean, you'd think food would be people-centered, but it really isn't when we think about modern industries and the choices we're using around resource use. And so the first principle is focuses on food for people and builds on knowledge and skills. These are traditional knowledges and skills. They're built around foodways in the place where the people are. And the idea here is that we need to build research that helps support these local food technologies. And also we need to be rejecting technologies that undermine or contaminate local food systems. This includes contamination of land, waterways, and air. And so, we've talked a lot about resource choices. Well, if I'm using tens of gallons of diesel gas to get product around the world for packaging, I am actually contaminating local food systems. If I'm using a ton of pesticides and I pollute my waterways and people can't drink the water, I'm not supporting my local food systems. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using some forms of pesticides, but there are better ways that have been developed than what we see in our agribusiness. The third principle is the idea that it works with nature. You've learned from all of your ancient studies of former civilizations that if you don't work with the natural environment, it doesn't go well for you. So we need to be improving adaptation and resilience. We need to be valuing the farmer, right? That's the provider and the pastoralist. And make sure that they're given their fair share and they have a say. The other one is localizing food systems. So you're going to watch a video called Kiss the Ground for this week, and that's all about how do we localize food systems. And then puts the control of the system locally as well. Not just grow it and eat it locally, but also put the control of the food systems in a local way. And the idea that we need to privatize resources is also something that's part of putting control locally. And the idea that food is sacred, that this is a gift, it shouldn't be squandered. We can't really commodify this in the way that we have. This system isn't working. And so when we think through these different ways of engaging with food sovereignty, we really shift the focus to a much more local, sustainable ideology around food systems. So that's all we have for the lecture on food, and I hope you have a great day.